22 morning, this is Breakfast with Stephen and Anne. Good morning to Erin, who's getting a homemade trifle today for Father's Day. No tea in bed that week, can't it?
You can't do it both ends of the day, can you? No. And Rachel says, I'm at work today in a restaurant. We have over 300 people booked in today, so I'm up early getting ready for a very busy day. I work with my husband, who is also working all day, making sure that everyone enjoys Father's Day. He is a great dad to our son, Oliver, but it'll be much later tonight before we are at home due to work. So can you wish him a happy Father's Day from me and Oliver, please? Yes, indeed. You didn't include his name. But husband of Rachel and father of Oliver, have a really fantastic Father's Day. It's going to be a busy one for you.
Dads don't need names, they're just dad.
Yeah, exactly. That's true, yes.
Let's take you through the papers this morning. Start with the Mail on Sunday. Keir Starmer does support the rail strikers, says the Mail on Sunday. The Labour leader says he doesn't want a walkout, but a leaked document says he backs union barons, as they put it.
The Sunday Telegraph reports on comments by the Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng that unions are bribing workers, his word, to strike. He said unions had been amassing a war chest for some time to fund summer chaos.
Sunday Times has the PM saying, steel yourselves for a longer war. Allies have been urged to hold their nerve on aid for Ukraine.
So let's go through the papers now. And joining us this morning, journalist and broadcaster Nabila Ramdani in amazing pink, and writer and commentator Benedict Spence. Who's not, but that's all right.
No,
hey, sorry, I don't to be critical of your sartorial elegance. Benedict, the rail strikes.
Yes, it's the front page of the Mail, isn't it? It says that Starmer supports the rail strikers, and I've got to be honest, I don't think that that's particularly shocking to most people. It's the Labour leader. He ought to be at least on the side of working people.
But he said the exact opposite.
No, he says that he wants to avoid a strike. That's not necessarily saying that he doesn't
want them to happen.
He doesn't want them to happen. That doesn't mean that he doesn't agree that they might have legitimate gripes. I think that that's the key thing. He recognises that this is going to affect millions of working people around the country, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all rail strikers shouldn't necessarily walk out in a bid to get themselves slightly better working conditions. The difficulty, of course, is when it comes to railway workers, we're always given the figure, aren't we? Train drivers, they get 70, 80 grand a year, but we're not really talking about those people. We're talking about everybody else, who I think the average wage for somebody who works on the railways in the UK is about 30, just under 30k, which actually, when you think about it, in the midst of a cost of living crisis and the fact that they haven't had a pay rise in about 4 years, is not all that much, and I do think there are legitimate gripes. Now, I'm supposed to be going on holiday on Tuesday, when the strikes are first happening, and I'm sat here going, well, my holiday isn't going to get off to a great start, what with everything else we've seen, but if I can sit here and say, actually, I do think there's not necessarily anything wrong with people trying to get a decent living wage for themselves, well, maybe it isn't particularly unfair then for the Labour leader to come out and say, well, yeah, I'm kind of on board with these strikes as well. I don't want them to happen, but these people do need to be paid.
But the way the Mail on Sunday is playing it is, so they're almost saying, if you are really seriously, I'm trying to think of the right word, messed up by the rail strikes and everything, don't blame the government, blame Keir Starmer because he's supporting it.
I mean, ultimately in this country, we haven't quite got to grips with that because, of course, we went through Thatcherism, we went through the whole business of privatising lots of things. Railways are natural monopolies. They're one of the few things that actually I don't think governments should be privatising because you can't have fair competition. And a lot of the gripes that the rail workers have about the amount of money that's being taken out of the system through dividends, these are completely legitimate gripes they have with their employers. And I think it's high time, actually, that governments in this country stopped passing the buck onto private companies, private employers, and actually brought the railways back into national ownership. It's one of the very few things that I'm on board with nationalising, but I don't see how this is a fair system. And as we're seeing, a lot of people aren't being paid a decent amount of money. Forget the train drivers. We're talking about cleaners. We're talking about people in ticket offices. Actually, a lot of people
worked so well last time.
Yeah, but that was a long time ago.
It was, but everything. The carriages were awful. They're
awful now. The service is awful now, and this is the thing, if it's going to be awful, let's at least keep as much of the money as we can in the system, rather than having the real thing that's
a lot better than it used to be.
Well, everything are a lot better than it used to be, and that's the nature of progress, but I think it's very telling that a lot of rail companies on the continent, for example, own shares in our railway companies, and they use the money that they take out of our railways to subsidise their own train services. I think that tells you a lot about how dysfunctional our system is.
Well, I personally think that the Mail on Sunday's front page is quite a legitimate one, in fact, because if you think about it, it's actually bizarre that Keir Starmer is not coming out more unequivocally in support of the trade unions. You know, at the end of the day, the Labour Party was literally set up to protect workers' rights against the bosses, and many would argue that it might have lost its way when Tony Blair was in charge, who, as we've seen, was more of a capitalist than a socialist. But it's now up to Keir Starmer to actually stamp his identity on his own party and come up with great new policies and get himself elected to put them.
Do you think that's the problem with him? He doesn't want to be Jeremy Corbyn and he doesn't want to be Tony Blair. We know what he doesn't want to be seen as, but he's having trouble actually saying what he is.
Well, I think what could turn out to be one of the biggest strikes in a generation is a perfect time, actually, for a Labour Party, for the Labour leader to be asserting his party's identity and indeed his own identity. And I think that the fact that he's failing to do that shows that he's a weak leader, and it triggers great concern for Labour Party supporters. I think,
Is he just aware, though, of the fact that actually there's an awful lot of people in the country who do not support these strikes, and he's thinking of winning votes?
Well, I think what this strike's all about, ultimately, is about fixing the economy. There's a very big gap between the rich and the poor, and, workers, low-level ones in particular, are the most affected by that. So the Labour Party, and all parties actually, should be doing whatever they can to come up with great new policies, and especially as far as the Labour Party is concerned, get themselves elected to try and do something about it.
What's the Sunday Telegraph saying about all this, Nabila?
It's an interesting story because it's effectively the business secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, who is accusing the biggest trade unions of effectively bribing workers to go on strike after they doubled daily payments to those taking part in industrial action. And I have to say, the story is written in very hyperbolic language, with the business secretary saying that the unions had been plotting a dangerous summer of chaos, or that indeed union chiefs had been quietly amassing a war chest to effectively bribe workers
But they always do
unleash.
that, don't they?
Absolutely,
The
I
biggest
think
unions try to provide strike pay, don't they?
it's actually a common thing to do for unions to give basically the workers an incentive to assert what they believe is their right to ask for better payment. So I don't see anything wrong with that. I think we can always argue whether going on strike is the right way to go about it. I think we all more or less have sympathy for workers, and the fact that they have to go on strike to achieve a better pay. Clearly, the traditional way of negotiating beer and sandwiches has failed, and that's why we're in this situation.
Well, I mean, this is what I don't understand now. It's down to who you believe. But Network Rail's chief negotiator says the RMT has finished the talks before we've actually finished. Our offers have been rejected. The union demands far from affordable. Network Rail's serious about trying to find a solution and work out a compromise that gives people a decent pay rise. Well, if the RMT's saying that, if you believe them, then it's... if Network Rail's saying that, then the RMT's just walked out and is determined to strike.
Yes, well, absolutely. I think the government has already pledged a 21 billion package to try and deal with their grievances, and it finds itself in a bit of a catch-22 situation, because if it gives in to workers, that means they're winning and they can do it again. But if they don't give in, then the anger and the frustration intensifies. And I would contend that we're not just looking at a week of chaos, but potentially a summer of discontent, especially if other aggrieved workers, such as NHS workers or indeed teachers, join in later on in the demonstrations.
I just find it amazing that in this modern world, we can't have experienced negotiators actually not letting this happen.
I mean, did you sit through Brexit like the rest of us were?
Well, yeah.
Going, good Lord, where are the experienced negotiators?
Yeah, where are they? I thought they were meant to be skilled at their jobs.
Meanwhile, there are some Tory MPs, according to the Mail on Sunday, Benedict, whose focus is purely on trying to get rid of the Prime Minister.
Yes, it's funny this, isn't it? How lots of people are very politically motivated when it comes to politics. This is the story that having tried and failed to oust Boris Johnson, a lot of backbenchers want to change the 1922 committee's rules about how often you can bring a vote of confidence against the Prime Minister. It's currently a year. They want to reduce it to 6 months, and they plan on doing this by flooding the committee itself with their own supporters, and they think that means that maybe then by Christmas, if things haven't picked up, they're going to be able to have another vote about about Boris Johnson. And I mean, Boris Johnson supporters are dismissing this as a sort of a Remainer-style plot. You know, they're framing it in those terms of, you know, just like Remainers wanted to not respect the result of the referendum vote, similar sort of Remain-minded anti-Boris MPs want to do the same here. The problem with that, of course, that line of questioning is that, yeah, there are a lot of very vocal, staunch Brexiteer MPs, people like Steve Baker, of course, who are just as unhappy with the Prime Minister. Lord Frost is all over the newspapers these days talking about how unhappy he is with the Prime Minister. So I think that's a little hard to frame it as simply a Remainer plot. But I would say actually that this is not the time to do this. I don't think that a lot of the backbenchers realise. They might have realised at the start, Boris Johnson is bedded in like a tick. He's not Margaret Thatcher, he's not John Major, and he doesn't care what did for those prime ministers. Ultimately, unless you get the critical number of votes with Boris Johnson, he's not going anywhere. If you want to keep on drawing this out and having lots and lots of leadership fights in the sort of the 24 months or so in the build-up to the next general election, well, that's fine. But that's just going to lead to lots of infighting. It's going to lead to more, you know, sort of blocks on government, more sort of chaos. Really, their best bet, having fumbled the effort to try to get rid of him, having put it off for so long, and then had a go and then failed, really, is probably to get round Boris Johnson, to get round the Prime Minister and try to make this work. Because right now, as we often talk about when it comes to the leadership, there are no real sort of standout candidates to replace them, so that even if he were ousted, whoever comes in has then got to try to create a bit of a sort of a profile that is enough to sort of stop there from being a hung parliament or, goodness knows, a defeat at the next general election. They've just not played it very well. And so I really do think that this idea of trying to change the rules to get rid of Boris Johnson this late in the game, I think that's a real high-risk strategy, frankly, for the Tory party.
Gosh, meanwhile, though, as we look towards a summer of discontent, as you were saying, or maybe even longer, the Ukraine war looks as though it's going to go on and on and on. I mean, that's something that we were told yesterday, wasn't it? We were talking to the President Zelensky's advisor, who said that they know that it's going to take a long time. And Boris Johnson has been warning all of the other countries, this is going to be a very long run.
Yeah, you've got 60 seconds to build.
Yes, well, it's a very powerful letter, and it's very much spot on. You know, we have to brace ourselves for the long term and offering committed long-term support to the Ukraine, because this war is not going to go anywhere. If you put it in perspective, the Ukraine is the size of Texas in the US, whereas Russia is almost twice the size of America, and it's you know, and its resources are massive. And I can't see Putin capitulating, especially as Boris Johnson put it quite rightly. He sees Ukraine as part of Imperial Russia.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
and Putin was actually made a speech yesterday, didn't he, threatening other countries that were in the former Soviet Union, that if you don't stand by us now, you'll be the next.
The age of the unipolar world is over, is what he said, and I think he's right.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? Look, Nabila, Benedict, thank you both very much indeed. We shall see you a little bit later on. We've got lots more coming up in the next hour, including looking back at the week that Royal Ascot, of all things, were you there?